Mr Chair, I'm very happy to take a call actually in this bill, and I've been waiting all evening for something to come up in debate that was worth responding to and wasn't more of the misinformation and scaremongering and beat-up rhetoric that we've heard from opposition parties all through this debate. And I've waited and we haven't heard anything to the point, Mr Chair, where I had to wonder if we're in here debating the same bill, because almost all of what I've heard is simply not correct. So let's run through what this part of the bill actually does. For a start, Mr Chairman, this part of the bill deals with interception capabilities, and what it does is it rewrites and replaces the 2004 law put in place by the Labour government. And I was very pleased to hear actually the member Claire Curran say that she has no problem with any of the provisions in the current law, which is great, because the provisions they spent an hour and a half before dinner complaining about are ones that are copied directly from the 2004 law. So given that Labour have just said they have no problem with the provision, well, look back at the Hansard. Look back at the Hansard. Mr Robertson, look back at the Hansard, read the bill. The definitions of network operators, telecommunications service, public telecommunications networks are word for word what Labour wrote in 2004. None of that has changed. The duty to assist on service providers has not changed. The fact that it applies to overseas service providers has not changed. The encryption requirements have not changed, and the privacy protections, and we've heard ad nauseum from Labour about how somehow this bill is going to destroy the privacy protections. The privacy protections have not changed, and in fact, we worked very hard with the Privacy Commissioner in the putting together of this bill, to the point where she indicated she was very happy with it. So for all the rhetoric, for all the scaremongering, we have a Privacy Commissioner who confirmed that the bill worked well, privacy protections that are carried over from 2004, definitions that are carried over from 2004, and if parties want to know if they are covered under the obligation of being network operators, there's a very simple test. There's a very simple test. The test is that if they weren't a network operator for the last 9 years under the provision that Labour have just told us they were very happy with, then they're not one now. The definition is the same, nothing has changed, and if you've read the bill, I'm sorry, Mr Chair, if members have read the bill, they will know that. So let's talk about the effect on service providers, because again we've had all of this rhetoric, some of it quite misinformed, about how it applies to service providers in this section. Now what happens is at the moment, if you provide a telecommunications service in New Zealand, you are subject to our law, and frankly my view is that if you are providing telecommunication services to New Zealanders, you should be subject to our law no matter where you're residing. So is it Labour's position that New Zealand companies should be bound, but anyone else should get off scot-free? Well, that's not my position. They have always been bound in New Zealand. They will continue to be. The concern about conflict of laws, in my view, was never an issue, and that's very clear under common law. But recognising that there was a concern, we have made it clear through the SOP that there is an absolute defence if there is a conflict of laws issue arising in that duty to assist. So there simply is no basis for concern in that regard. Equally, Mr Chair, we have heard comments that this somehow is a new and puts us out of step with the rest of the world, which again is not true. Just recently we've had the Australian Parliament confirm already that their service providers are regarded as being within the full interception capabilities in Australia. So we haven't even gone that far. That is the case in Australia. And Mr Speaker, can I also confirm that as I said, with the service providers, their obligations have not changed. They have protection from conflict of laws. It isn't internationally inconsistent. And the interesting thing for me is that the New Zealand telecommunications companies actually put submissions in saying, why weren't the service providers subject to full obligation straight away? So if Labour's position is right, and we're being far too hard on these poor overseas multinationals, then they would be taking the opposite position of what New Zealand companies want, which is actually full extension of powers to service providers right now. That's what the New Zealand telco wants, so Labour has to decide whether they're backing the overseas mega multinationals or whether they're backing New Zealand companies. Our view is that at the moment we're in the right space. We have the duty to assist, and for now that is sufficient. If in the future there needs to be a greater level of obligation, bringing us into line with what New Zealand companies want and what overseas jurisdictions already do, then we have a process to do it, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Chair, it is completely wrong to say that there are no checks and balances on that process. The process is very clearly set out in legislation. It is akin to what ministers do under any number of pieces of legislation with granting exemptions or putting restrictions in place. It is subject to the review of a specifically and highly qualified review panel, and of course it's subject to judicial review. Mr. Chair, it would make no sense to have a standing panel sitting around waiting for the odd situation where this would occur. Now, I know Labor loves to set up committees and panels and put all their mates on it, but having a panel sitting there doing nothing for the odd occasion that this might happen. Oh, you want to talk about Mike Williams? Then they can do that. But in our world, you don't do that. You have an appointed ad hoc panel who can have the skills and expertise needed in that case. Yes, appointed by the Minister, Ms Curran, very well spotted. You can read. So it is an ad hoc panel appointed to serve the needs of that provision. They are an independent panel and they report back and how that works. And if people have concerns, there are, of course, other processes they can follow to review that as well. So, Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. This provision does not in any way change the power of these agencies. And we've heard from Mr Horan and from the Greens and from New Zealand First that somehow this is open slather for people to access our networks. Now, anyone who says that, frankly, is being absolutely duplicitous and giving quite false information. It is clear from the most basic reading of this bill, nothing in this changes what can be accessed or by whom. The warranting powers are in other legislation. They determine what can be looked at. This is simply the mechanism by which that warrant is given effect to. Nothing in this bill changes the warranting powers. Nothing extends the warranting powers. All this bill talks to is the extent to which they can be given effect to. And let's be very clear, the reason for this bill and this part of the bill is that it reduces the cost of compliance and the compliance time and commitment for companies in carrying out interception. Under the law that Labor wrote, there was the requirement for full, standing intercept capability on every provider of any size at every level. That is not necessary, it was hugely burdensome, and it didn't work for industry. This bill reduces that cost, it reduces it by tens of millions of dollars potentially, and it reduces the compliance, time and cost on those companies. Anybody can see that to have a much more tiered, proportionate, sophisticated response targeted to where we need it is better than a blank, everyone invest fully in areas where it's simply not needed. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill simply modernises that part of the framework where the warrants are granted under other legislation and given effect to. It is business friendly, it strikes the right balance between need and future-proofing, it maintains all the privacy protections, and it does not extend the reach any further.
Claire Curran.
Mr. Chair, this minister does not understand her own bill, does not understand the impact of it, or she's got her fingers in her ears. And just to talk about the response from industry, NZ Rise is a credible organisation which represents